This is very much a work in progress, Esther, Joseph, and the Theistic Gestalt. I want to start by talking a little bit about what I mean by this Theistic Gestalt thing, and then I'll get back to Esther and Joseph. I was supposed to animate that beautifully, and each bullet point was going to come in separately. I just forgot to do that. Anyway, that's not Jerry Walls. That's C.S. Lewis. Jerry Walls presents an argument for the existence of God that I'm not going to endorse today as like a proof for God's existence or even a compelling argument. I just want to discuss the argument to think about some of its properties. And it's an argument that he develops based upon a suggestion that Alvin Plantinga had made in a lecture many years before. It was a project. Plantinga gave a lecture in the 80s called 24 or so Arguments for the Existence of God. And then Jerry Walls and Trent Doherty put together a book where philosophers took each one of the 24 or so arguments and tried to develop them into something larger than the kind of argument sketches that Plantinga had given. One of the arguments that Walls develops in that book is what you could call an argument from love. So the argument would go something like this. According to Richard Dawkins, monogamous romantic love can only appear irrational and counter to the demands of evolution by natural selection. He writes, rather than the fanatically monogamous devotion to which we're susceptible, some sort of polyamory is on the face of it more rational. Perhaps monogamy, that's the end of the quote, and I continue, but paraphrasing him, perhaps monogamy in an exclusive romantic love can serve a short-term Darwinian purpose, which is to engender loyalty to one co-parent for long enough to raise a human child. But there's no discernible evolutionary advantage to monogamy beyond that point, according to Dawkins. And he would rather say that romantic love is something of an evolutionary quirk or mistake that some species exhibit, humans and swans famously, though neither species is without examples of infidelity, sometimes systematically, sometimes opportunistically, but nonetheless, they do exhibit monogamous behavior for the large part. And Dawkins would say that's something of a bad evolutionary strategy. You can explain how these happen and how they stick, but C.S. Lewis, in contrast, thinks that human love serves a very important kind of cosmic purpose. So it's far from an accident of evolution that we experience it. He describes erotic love as a paradigm or example built into our natures of the love we ought to exercise towards God and man. Since Tsachi emphasized the role that love might play in a Christian context, I should have brought a Jewish quote because I think you can find such things in Judaism too. Maimonides, for example, in Hilchot Tshuva in Sefer Madar of his Mishnah Torah, he says that a person should be lovesick for God, and that the experience that a young person has when they can't get their beloved out of their mind is what we should try to experience for God. So in a similar way, perhaps, for Maimonides as for C.S. Lewis, love is the human love, interhuman love, both of the agape and of eros, serve some sort of role as a pedagogic role in our lives when directed towards God. Now, the argument, which I don't give even in schematic form here, the argument says something like this. Look, if you have two theories of the world, one of them takes something which is pre-theoretically very central to our lives and says it's actually an accident or a mistake or kind of insignificant cosmically. And the other theory of the world takes that same phenomenon that pre-theoretically we take to be of central importance and preserves its importance. Then all other things being equal, that's a point in favor of the theory that preserves the importance of the phenomenon. So in this case, the idea is that some sort of theistic worldview has an explanatory or theoretical advantage over a kind of naturalistic worldview, because the theistic worldview is able to preserve the pre-theoretical importance that we place on love. Now, that's not to say that Dawkins is obviously wrong. And like I said, I don't want to endorse this argument. But it often turns out that things we took to be important turn out not to be important, or things that we took to be of cosmic centrality turn out not to be. And we have to revise our pre-theoretical intuitions and evaluations. But nonetheless, to the extent that you can preserve the intuitive, we generally think that's at least a theoretical advantage. And this is related to something I want to call the Theistic Gestalt in the following way. So you take the famous rabbit-duck illustration that, you can see it as a duck with its beak facing to the right-hand corner of the screen and its eye looking, out at us, I suppose. You could also see it as a rabbit. Its face is facing this way then, and what was the beak becomes the two ears of the rabbit. We would struggle to see it as both at once, or at least to attend fully to its rabbitness whilst attending fully to its duckishness. It's as if the one view somehow temporarily blocks out the other view. But the underlying reality is one that has both duckish and rabbitish properties. It's just somehow you can't attend to both at once, or attend fully to both at once. And I want to say how that relates to the love argument. And this is based on conversations I've had with a colleague of mine, Ariel Meirav, and we might write a paper about this notion of the theistic gestalt. The idea is that it's as if the Darwinian explanation of the world captures one aspect of reality, and it's not like it even, potentially, it's not even misdescribing love. Love is an evolutionary mistake, and yes, love is a bad evolutionary strategy. That's entirely true. Just like this, this is a rabbit, right? But it's also a duck, and therefore love is also something else that has this great cosmic significance. And somehow it's as if Dawkins is only attending to one aspect of reality, which he accurately describes, but where the distortion enters his picture is he takes what he has accurately described as the sum total of reality, whereas what he has accurately described is one aspect of reality. It would be like a totally accurate description of this rabbit that doesn't get anything wrong, other than the only element of distortion would enter the picture if my description of this rabbit somehow made the totalizing claim that there's nothing duckish here at all. I'm going to move on to the Bible. We'll bring this all together. Maybe the discussions will help. I want to look at two biblical texts. One from the book of Genesis, from the conclusion, really, of the story of Joseph and his brothers. Many of you know the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. I didn't even go for Thomas Mann, right? And the book of Esther, which we were discussing this morning. One of the things that sometimes is obscured by source criticism is the remarkably striking narrative parallels between different books and segments of the Bible. Joseph and Esther as two characters, Joseph and Esther as two characters are remarkably parallel, such that it's hard to imagine that it wasn't on purpose. How so? Well, Joseph and Esther are both born into a Jewish family, but find themselves taken into a Gentile environment. In the case of Joseph, he's sold into slavery. In the case of Esther, she is married off and has to hide her Jewish identity, forcibly wed, really, to the king in the story, to Ahasuerus. And now the parallels don't end there. Of course, those parallels could also be extended to include Moses, who also is born into a Jewish family, is raised in the house of Pharaoh. But actually, the parallels between Joseph and Esther are more extensive. They're both sexually objectified by their extensive owners, right? Esther and Joseph. They both have non-Jewish names foisted upon them. Maybe that happens with Moses too. That's a debate. But Joseph is called Safnat Paneach by the Pharaoh. I don't know how that's translated into how that's pronounced in the English. Esther, of course, is really called Hadassah. Hadassah is her Hebrew name, and Esther is probably a Persian name that was imposed upon her. It relates to Ishtar, the Persian goddess. In the book of Daniel, it says that the Persians would give Jewish people the names of Persian gods almost as a way of oppressing them, right? So it might also have been that Mordecai was named after Marduk, and that wasn't really his Jewish name. Hadassah, we're told what her name is. Anyway, the parallels are multiple, and I won't go into them more, but. These two sections of the narrative are also strikingly similar, and we'll see why in a moment. Oh, also, Joseph and Esther, one thing that's worth noting is in the early stages of both their stories, they're very, very passive. Things keep happening to them. But towards the end of the story, they really take control of events. And there are these kind of pivotal moments where both Joseph and Esther go from being subjects to agents, really. But anyway, I said I would stop drawing parallels, and then I carried on. Sorry. But it's just so much fun, isn't it? So here, in the book of Genesis, after Jacob dies, and ostensibly the story's over, they've all been reconciled to one another, Joseph and their brothers. The brothers are fearful that Joseph's forgiveness was skin deep, and now that Jacob the father is dead, old scars will reopen, and Joseph may be in the mood for revenge, and they confront their brother. They seem to make up a story, a lie. They say, Jacob told us before he died, please, be kind to us or something, which could be true, but it's not reported in the narrative that Jacob did that, right? So maybe they made it up. Either way, Joseph replies to them here in verse 19, and it goes on to verse 21. Joseph said to them, have no fear. Am I a substitute for God? Meaning, like, I'm not someone who can judge you, that's for God. Besides, although you intended me harm, God intended it for good, so as to bring about the present result, the survival of many people, because Joseph had become viceroy of Egypt, and he'd managed to save his family and save many other people too. And so fear not, I'll sustain you in your dependence. Thus he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. What he wants to say is, you were intending one thing, and yeah, that was really bad, and the judgment of that's up to God, but God was intending something else, and it was all for the good. In the book of Esther, this is actually the point at which, just after these verses, Esther becomes active rather than passive. Mordecai delivers this message to Esther. He says, don't imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life being in the king's palace. Just because at the moment your identity is covered up, they don't know that you're Jewish, don't think this genocide will occur and you'll get off scot-free. Eventually, you'll be figured out and killed as well. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter. Right? So God is definitely going to save us, is the implication. Famously, the book of Esther is the only book of the Hebrew Bible in which the name of God or any explicit reference to God is what's the word I'm looking for? It's not there. There is no missing, conspicuous by its absence, right? In fact, the rabbis have a play on words that Esther sounds like the word Hester. It's not etymologically related, but the word Hester means to hide, and when God hides his face, there's this notion of Hester Panim, God's hidden face. God's face is hidden throughout the book of Esther, just like Esther's identity is hidden. Anyway, I don't think it's a stretch, despite the fact that the book of Esther doesn't mention God. I don't think it's a stretch to think that Mordecai is expressing some sort of religious faith here. He says, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews, right? Why would you think that? Well, if you ascribe to Mordecai traditional Jewish beliefs of a providential God, it's not a mystery why he would think that. Relief and deliverance will come to the Jews for another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. Right? So what seems to be similar here is that history seems to be unfolding on two levels. There's what the human agents are doing, and there's what God's purposes are. And it's as if God, so to speak, has his own narrative purposes in history. In the Genesis narrative, it doesn't look like there's any scope for free will at all, right? Whatever decisions they made them for harm, but it turned out for good anyway. Here, it's a slightly looser providential grasp that God has over history. It's as if the general contours of history are settled by God. You know, deliverance will come, but who plays a role in bringing that deliverance and who exactly will be saved and who will perish? That's somehow, up for grabs, and it's up to Esther. Although there's the final words of the excerpt we have on this slide says, but who knows? Perhaps you've attained to royal position for just such a crisis, which again is hard to read without some sort of theological gloss. That the divine purpose of, don't think it was just pure luck that you happened to become Queen of Persia at this time. And that, incidentally, after telling you I wouldn't go through more parallels of Joseph and Esther, is a massive parallel in the story of Joseph and the story of Esther. Lots of things in both stories look like they happen because of happenstance, because of luck. In fact, the festival of Purim is named after the lots that Haman draws. He draws a lottery of dates to see on what date will the Jewish people be killed. So it's quite obvious, and the festival is named in the book of Esther, that there's some comment going on about like how much is up to luck and how much isn't, is I think an explicit theme of the book of Esther. Joseph, when he goes to meet his brothers, and his brothers are going to sell him into slavery, he can't find them. He doesn't know where they are. And there's this mysterious man in the field who doesn't get named, and Joseph asks them for directions. He says, I know where your brothers are. And in retrospect, that moment is given this great kind of dramatic weight, because you're left to think, he almost didn't, his being lost would have been helpful for him. That's why I was responding to Greg's point that yes, I think the Bible does encourage us very often, or at least a religious reception of texts encourages us very often to kind of make the events of the narrative necessary. But in these instances, at least, it's as if the narrative is directly asking us to ask counterfactual questions. Like, yeah, but what would have happened if this mysterious man wasn't in the field, right? If Esther hadn't risen to providence. Now, I want to deal with, just briefly, before I ask some more explicitly philosophical questions about these two narratives, I want to share with you some commentary on the story of Joseph from my late teacher, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. I actually think his greatest works were his weekly biblical homilies. I think they kind of stand up to greater scrutiny, and I think they may eventually be a larger part of his legacy than the many books that he wrote. And this is from one of his homilies on the weekly readings of the Torah. But he talks about how Joseph is encouraging his brothers in the text to reinterpret their past and to redeem their past by reinterpreting it. So, yes, at the time you did it, you intended harm, but now, in the full, with the benefit of hindsight, new interpretations are available of what was going on, and those interpretations can be redemptive. And he says, he continues by saying, we find this in Judaism throughout its history. The prophets reinterpreted biblical narrative for their day. Then came Midrash, which reinterpreted it more radically because the situation of Jews had changed more radically. Then came the great biblical commentators and mystics and philosophers. There has hardly been a generation in all of Jewish history where Jews didn't reinterpret their texts in the light of the present tense experience. We are the people who tell stories and then retell them repeatedly, each time with a slightly different emphasis, establishing a connection between then and now, rereading the past in the light of the present as best we can. It is by telling stories that we make sense of our lives and the life of our people, and it's by allowing the present to reshape our understanding of the past that we redeem history and make it live as a positive force in our lives. But here are some philosophical questions. It's all very well for Rabbi Sacks to say that, we can put a positive spin on history after things have unfolded. That's nice. But, how can reinterpretation of the past relieve Joseph's brothers of their guilt? Right? They still did something terrible, and therefore it's not all that comforting to say, oh, it turned out all right. Like, okay, it turned out all right, but so that's one question. And the second question, of course, has been bubbling behind the scenes and right from the get-go when I introduced these two texts from Genesis and Esther. How is the providential hand of God in these stories supposed to be, indeed if it is supposed to be, compatible with the agency of the protagonists, with their free will? Well, I think Rabbi Sacks, in another homily on the same chapter of Genesis, goes some way to answering one of our questions. He says, once the brothers had undergone complete repentance, their original intent was cancelled out. It was now possible to see the good as well as the bad consequences of their act and to attribute the former to them. Paraphrasing Shakespeare's Mark Antony, the good they did would live after them, the bad was interred with the past. That is how, through repentance, and he's quoting a first century rabbinic sage called Reish Lakish, who started out his life as a bandit before repenting and becoming a rabbi. Reish Lakish had this doctrine that through the power of repentance, deliberate sins can be accounted as merits. Or as Joseph put it, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. This is a hugely significant idea, for it means that by a change of heart, we can redeem the past. What he was saying in the bit of text that's obscured on my slide is that our actions have many consequences. Some of our consequences are good, some of the consequences are bad. Some of the consequences are intended, some of the consequences are unintended. And Rabbi Sacks is suggesting a theory of atonement or repentance, according to which, to the extent that you are unpenitent, the negative consequences of your actions, especially the intended negative consequences of your actions, in a sense belong to you, and they're part of what make you culpable. But if you have done everything humanly possible to repair the damage that you did to the victims of your crimes, and you have repented and tried to heal yourself, there's a sense in which you now disavow those past intentions that you had. And the grace of God, so to speak, I know grace is a very Christian notion, but by the grace of God, so to speak, in the mechanics of atonement, what God does to the truly penitent is he says, oh, okay, I will no longer attribute the negative consequences of those actions to you. But do you know what? If they did have any unintended positive consequences, those can still be yours, right? And Rabbi Sachs is kind of wanting to read that into what Joseph is saying. You know, God will judge whether you are sufficiently penitent, right? But if he does so judge, then the good that came out of the bad things you did, that will live forever. But the bad, that's interred with the past. So, in a sense, what Rabbi Sachs is addressing is the first of the philosophical questions I raised, which is, you know, how can reinterpreting the past absolve the brothers of their guilt? Well, it can, if the reinterpretation of their past is part of a reformation of their character that comes along with as well, of course, or might be preconditioned upon doing all that you can to remedy any damage that you did to others. You know, it doesn't come for free. I wanted to share with you a midrash on the book of Exodus, the book of Esther. Esther Abba is a rabbinic, a collection of rabbinic homilies from. It's a Palestinian midrash, so it's from the land of Israel. Redacted somewhere between the 4th and the 6th century of the Common Era. I will translate it for those who struggle. But before I do, I have this very strange idea that I think is a biblical idea, that God has the ability to change the past in more dramatic ways than what Rabbi Sachs was speaking about. What Rabbi Sachs was speaking about is the lasting significance of the past, and, you know, which consequences of which actions are going to be attributed to which agents in terms of punishment and reward. But there's no real changing of the actual events of the past. I think the authors of the Hebrew Bible toyed with the idea that in the end of time, the parts of history that God isn't satisfied with will actually be erased, such that it will no longer be the case that they will have happened. I see this, for example, when, and I'm following the commentary, the medieval commentary of Rabbi Chaim ibn Attar, the Ora Chaim, on the book of Exodus, when Moses says, God, if you don't forgive the Jewish people for the sin of the golden calf, then please erase me from the book that you have written. Now, there's a debate about what book that is. Some people would say it's the Pentateuch itself, but of course the Pentateuch very rarely, if ever, refers to itself as a single book. Moses sometimes talks about this Torah that we've received, but that's very often either a reference only to the book of Deuteronomy or to individual sections of law, like the Torah of the Nazarite or the Torah of the burnt offering. So it's actually quite a jump to say Moses is saying, erase me from the Pentateuch, whereas there was a classic idea that God keeps a book of history, just like the king in the book of Esther keeps a book of chronicles that he reads to learn, who's been good to me, who's been bad to me. There's an idea that God, as the heavenly king, keeps a book like that. And Moses says, I don't want to be part of that book if you're not going to forgive the Jewish people, which Chaim ibn Ashta suggests, I want to be written out of history itself, because of course if it's not recorded in the divine history, then how can you say it even happened once it's been erased, so to speak? In the book of Isaiah, God says, or God is reported to have said through Isaiah, Anochi, Anochi, hu mocheh peshaecha, I, even I, am he who erases your sins, v'chatotecha lo eskor, and your transgressions I will not recall. Well, if you attribute to the authors of the Bible kind of omniscience, that God knows everything, how can he not recall something that happened? Well, the verse explains, Anochi, Anochi, hu mocheh peshaecha, I erase them. And because I erase them, I can't recall them. Right? I'm going to make it such that they didn't happen. And in the book of Jeremiah, it says, in the end of days, the enemies of the Jewish people will search for the sins of Israel, but they will find no sins. Now, that could be read the contemporary sins, right, because they're not sinning anymore. But it could be read in this kind of biblical vein that somehow, by the end of time, God will have erased the bad bits. And I want to suggest that the authors of this midrash see something of that eschatology in their reading of Mordechai's words to Esther, right? So the verse says, Ki im hacharesh tacharishi, which means if you are silent at this moment, and then that's Ki im hacharish tacharishi, if you're silent at this moment, and the verse continues, Revach v'hatzala yamod liyudim imakom acher, salvation and or Revach v'hatzala, they're two synonyms of salvation. How would you translate that, Sachi? But it means relief in this context. Yeah, it comes from width, but it means relief. Relief and salvation will come to the Jews from somewhere else. Right. Now, hacharish tacharishi, you'll be able to, even without any Hebrew, you can see it's kind of a repetition, right? It's an emphatic. So like, it's like, you're really going to stay silent, right? It's like silence twice. But playing with the grammar, the Midrash says, no, this is what Mordechai is saying. Im tishtaki achshav, if you're silent now, shalola lamed senagoria al umatech, that you won't perform the function of the defense counsel for the Jewish people, right? If you're silent now and you refuse to play that role, sofech lishtok liatid lavo. In the end of days, in the final times, you're going to be quiet there. Ve'ein lach pitchon peh, which literally means you'll have no opening mouth. It's an idiom, something like you won't have anything to say. You won't have. It's like you won't have a leg to stand on, but you'll be silent then. Lama? Why? Sha'at yachola la'asot tova b'yamayich, because you were able to do good in your days. V'lo asit, but you didn't. And what do you think? You think God is going to just leave the Jewish people, that God's just going to leave the Jewish people to their genocidal fate? Whatever happens, God is going to bring them a redeemer. The only question is, would it be you? As it says, relief and salvation will come. The play on words is, it's literally hacharesh tacharishi, silent, and they're reading this in the future tense, right? If you're silent now, you'll be silent in the future, and it's quite a nice homily. It's quite a nice play on words. Deafness, that's right. If you're deaf now, you'll be deaf then too, right? So I kind of want to say, look, I've written a lot about this past-changing eschatology. I don't think the biblical writers had a well-worked-out systematic metaphysics for making sense of it. Tyrone Goldschmidt and I have tried to provide that in a very eccentric paper of ours called, just one of the many very eccentric things I've co-authored with him or by myself, but called The Promise of a New Past, which is in Philosopher's Imprint. But one way of looking at it is that history itself is a work in progress that will be edited in multiple stages. And there's an open question whether any one of us will actually even appear in the final cut, right? It depends if we do anything worth saving, right? We might not even appear in history at all. And maybe it's a bit of a creative rereading, but I don't think it's too far from the spirit of this midrash to say, Esther, are you going to be a main character in this thing called history or not? Right? Because if you don't speak now, you'll be somehow silenced forever, right? Anyway, I thought that was cool. Right. So there are things we can say about how the reinterpretation of the past can relieve Joseph's brothers of their guilt. There are things we can say in the book of Esther, at least, about the way that the providential hand interacts with the freedom of the protagonists, because actually in that respect, Esther is the less problematic text, as I said, because it seems to presume a kind of looser providence, that God will make sure that everything turns out all right somehow or other, but whereas in the Genesis text, the providential grasp seems to be much more tight. In the model I present as like God as a patient director who takes multiple, he'll do multiple edits. There's also room for both a providential hand and a significant degree of freedom. But the last thing I want to throw into the mix is this thing I call Hasidic idealism, and then I want to tie it back to the Gestalt stuff. I think that Hasidic idealism will help us to make sense of how even in the Joseph story we can reconcile the very strong providential hand that Joseph thinks is being played with the freedom and agency of the protagonists. And the way to do it is as follows. Hasidic idealism is the view that we accurately describe fundamental reality when we say that we are merely figments in the divine imagination. We say that what we call the history of the universe is for God a story in his mind. And that is the fundamental metaphysics of Hasidic idealism. Why would anybody think that? That's a question for a different time. I actually think, and some people might just see this as a powerful reductio ad absurdum on theism itself. I actually think it follows from theism. I think it's very hard for the theism to get away from this picture. So much the worse for theism if you don't like this picture. I'm okay with it. But so the world is a story in the mind of God. But one thing you have to really pay attention to in Hasidic idealism, and it's something I think the Hasidic masters, who were early modern Eastern European pietists, something I think they were really good at paying attention to is that, well, what's true in the story and what's true for the author can be different things, right? There's truth relative to the story, what's going on in the story. In fact, God appears in his own story as a character. And some of the properties he has as a character in the story might not be the same as the properties he has outside of the story. And in fact, in Jewish mysticism, in the story, God doesn't seem to be entirely perfect. And he says to Moses, nobody can see all of my goodness and live. It's as if somehow God as he presents himself in the story is a less perfect being than he really is. So you've got these two levels. So then you say, well, it really can be true that, Hamlet kills his uncle because he feels that revenge is the only honourable thing to do in that situation or something like that. It's also true to say Hamlet kills his uncle because that's the way Shakespeare wrote it. But those claims are operating at different kind of diegetic levels, right? One is true relative to the story, and one is true. But then you get these strange postmodern stories where the author appears in the story, like when Kurt Vonnegut comes and confronts Kilgore Trout at the end of Breakfast of Champions and says, "Mr. Trout, you're a fictional character in my story." And you say, well, in the story, is he a fictional character? Like, it becomes quite difficult to pass the semantics there. The Hasidic idealist, and I'm not saying that the biblical authors had preempted this crazy view at all, but I would say that it's an interesting way of making sense of what Joseph's saying. Joseph's saying, relative to the story, right, you were totally and utterly free when you decided to do those rotten things. But it's true at some other level of reality or relative to some other discourse that God had his own narrative purposes when telling this story of the brothers selling their brother into slavery. And somehow, because this is like a postmodern novel, both things somehow have their place within the story itself, because this is a story in which God tells us that he's a story writer and that we are just his characters. But it's very, very hard to attend to both things at once. It's very hard to attend to it being, just God intending good, whilst also attending to the brothers doing a terrible thing of their own freedom. But just because it's very hard to attend to both fully at once doesn't mean that they're not both aspects of, to take it right back to the beginning, it could well be that humanity evolved by absolute fluke, right? Because of random genetic mutations. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't totally and utterly determined by God. What do I mean? Well, totally fluky things can happen in a story. And it's true relative to the story that they're totally and utterly fluky. I'll leave you with one little anecdote. I was at a public rabbinic kind of conference where I was speaking not with my academic hat, but with more of a rabbinic hat. And it was in South Africa. And that morning I'd gone to pray in the local synagogue in Cape Town. And I was putting on my phylacteries, as we do in the morning. And somebody's Google Maps had been left on their phone. And as I was putting my phylacteries on, the phone erupted with, "Where do you want to go this morning?" And I know, right, that happened. I know what the causal story of that happening was. It was the guy, forgetting to put his phone on silent, forgetting to turn it off. That's exactly what happened. But can I think that that's the case? Well, I'll also think maybe God was asking me a question as I put my phylacteries on unthinkingly in a robotic, habitual way, and a voice comes out from nowhere saying, "Sam, where do you want to go this morning?" Right? Like how, maybe Hasidic idealism makes room for both to be true, for it to be the case that it'd be silly to think God was acting on the phone, right? That's a stupid causal story of what was going on, because in the story, that's not what was going on. In the story, it's just a piece of technology behaving as it should because its operator didn't make it silent. But yet, at some other level, if you think this whole world is a story authored by God, you're allowed to interpret it thusly as well. It depends on this theistic gestalt that we started with. And there you go. Okay.